Hi, this is Tapcat, and today I'd like to share my impressions of Gears Tactics, a new game developed by the Coalition and Splash Damage, published by Xbox Game Studios. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we'll cover my experiences playing through a good chunk of the campaign multiple times on different difficulty levels, and then do a high-level comparison to XCOM. And we'll do that in as much detail as possible without spoilers. The only mission footage I'll show is from very early in the campaign, and I'll do my best to avoid discussion of any specifics related to bosses, story, and anything that would generally be considered spoilery. Before I go any further, I need to acknowledge that this video was made possible thanks to receiving a free copy of the game from the publisher prior to release. They've given me nothing else, put no conditions on what I can say, or even required me to produce anything at all, but I did want you to know. My goal is to both show and tell the basics of what it's like to play Gears Tactics to help you decide if it's a game you'd like to buy. And part of how we'll do that is to compare it to the reigning heavyweight champ in the genre, XCOM, but I'll save most of those thoughts until the end. And if that sounds good to you, then let's get started. If you've ever played XCOM or other similar games, then the bones of Gears Tactics will seem familiar to you. Your soldiers, or Gears as they're known in this world, will have a certain number of action points each turn, usually 3. They can move, fire, go on Overwatch, use special abilities, and generally do the kinds of things you might expect. And while there's no grid shown on the map, if you experiment even a little with slowly moving the cursor around to show where it is your soldier would move to, it becomes obvious that it's still there under the surface. The basics of combat are also familiar. Our goal is to maneuver in such a way that we stay behind cover while getting around the enemies in order to get as high a chance to hit as possible. And needless to say, they're trying to get at us at the same time. But before I make it sound like Gears Tactics is just an XCOM clone, there are some huge differences. First, attacking does not end a soldier's turn. If they have enough ammunition and don't need to move, they can literally fire 3 times in a row in a single turn. Against enemies with a low health total, that can mean 3 shots and 3 kills from 1 gear. And that can be a very satisfying turn. Unfortunately, a lot of enemies have enough health that you can't always bring them down fast, even with 3 shots in a turn. Just about the only action that will end a soldier's turn automatically is Overwatch. And while that's pretty much what I'd expect, it otherwise worked in a way that I hadn't seen before. Rather than just firing once at the first enemy to move, the squad will keep firing as long as their ammunition holds out. And scoring a strong enough hit interrupts the enemy and stops them from continuing whatever they were trying to do when they triggered Overwatch fire. Making that happen can also be very satisfying, but beware of the fact that enemy Overwatch can and will do exactly the same thing to you. Overall, I found the enemy AI to be both effective and aggressive. Enemies with short-range weapons and melee attacks relentlessly move to get in close and prioritize attacking and hurting your squad even over protecting themselves. Meanwhile, snipers will dig in from far away and constantly harass you from long range until you can fight your way through to them. But what really dials up the challenge level is that enemy reinforcements are repeatedly dropped onto the map during most missions. They can land anywhere. They come in turn after turn and can really push your squad to the breaking point when they come in from behind or on a particularly exposed flank. It's not that any of this represents tactical wizardry exactly, but the developers have created an overall combat experience that hammers at your crew so relentlessly that it often feels more like you're just trying to survive rather than trying to win. And if that isn't enough, there's almost always a mission parameter pushing you forward whether you're ready to go or not. Now, I want to avoid spoilers, so let me just say that it can vary for anything from rewards for collecting all of the different loot scattered around the map to the threat of doom pushing you forward from behind. Trust me, you will feel the whip on your back and the pressure to drive your beleaguered squad onward, ever onward. One thing I haven't talked about yet is that Gears is structured into a number of acts, and each act has a certain number of chapters. At the end of each act is a boss fight, and as with all of the campaign story missions, it has to be beaten in order for you to move on. Thankfully, as with most missions, there are a few checkpoints, so if you get beaten at some point, you do have the option of reloading from there rather than starting over all the way back at the beginning. Now, I am not going to spoil the specifics of any boss or how to beat it, but we do need to cover the basics of what the fights are like. So as one might expect, bosses have health. A lot of health. You can expect attacks, some of which will only hurt your gears, and some which will absolutely wreck them. So you'll need to figure out how to dodge or mitigate those attacks, chip away at his health, and stay alive long enough to actually beat the damned thing. Sound simple? Well, don't worry, because the enemy reinforcements I mentioned earlier will also be joining the party for boss fights and doing their level best to kill your squad while this is going on. Now, there can easily be turns where you'll be lucky if even one soldier is able to target the boss while you deal with these reinforcements. Now, let me just state the obvious. This is a boss fight we're talking about. It's meant to be hard. It's meant to push you to your absolute maximum effort to win through. The point I want to make clear is that the challenge of a typical mission can already be fairly stiff, and you need to expect that to seriously ramp up when you take on a boss. Depending on your personal preference, that might be good or it might not. I just want to make sure you know what's waiting for you. As I mentioned at the start, I spent time playing on 3 of the 4 levels of difficulty, and the only one I skipped is Insane, because at that point, I was willing to take their word for it. Beginner is honestly pretty well named. It has all the same mechanisms and will teach a newcomer the game without being too punishing. Enemies have less health, there are fewer reinforcements, and I'm almost sure that the RNG is tuned so that enemies are less likely to hit an already wounded soldier. There's definitely less sense of that pressure I was talking about, but the downside to Beginner is that if you do a good enough job of learning your squad's tactics, then you'll almost certainly want more of a challenge. But if you feel like you're just crushing Beginner, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should skip past Intermediate, because it is quite a significant leap forward. There are significantly more enemies with more health, and the AI basically feels as though it's been unchained. I would say this is where the game really starts to come into its own and bring the kind of beatdowns that players who crave a challenge are really looking for. In comparison, Experienced feels like more of an incremental step up from Intermediate, and the main change that I noticed was that all of the enemies had more health. Now that's no small thing, of course. It often translated into needing more shots per enemy, and it's hard to come by those extra actions in a game that's pushing your squad forward as frequently as Gears Tactics. We've talked a lot about the soldiers in action on the battlefield, but let's talk about them back at the base. And we'll start with their skill trees. Now, each class has its own skill tree, and each of those trees has 4 branches that you can push down into. The basic system is certainly familiar. Level up and get skill points. Each skill costs 1 point, and you're free to either push deep into one branch of the tree or dabble with early options from multiple branches. Honestly, I thought some of the early picks looked really good. At the same time, some of these abilities can be leveled up and made more powerful the deeper you go into one branch. I won't even begin to claim that I knew what would constitute an optimal build, and that was a concern I had at first. How do you make choices with so many options and no experience in the game? Well, for starters, I love that we actually get to see the entire tree even though most of it isn't unlocked. I know Gears Tactics isn't the first game to do that, but there have definitely been others that don't, and I'm looking at you, XCOM. You'll also earn respec tokens very early in the campaign, and then periodically after that. I don't know if enough will come your way to respec everyone on the roster, but there should certainly be enough to fix your worst mistakes or min-max someone you see as particularly crucial. In any case, I opted to treat it as a learning experience. After picking whatever abilities look best for one character of a given class, I'd purposely go into a different branch for the next one who started leveling up. The only downside to that was keeping track of all the passive abilities that all of the different characters had, because it really starts to add up after a while. And keeping it straight matters quite a bit when you can trigger something like a squad-wide heal if you use one character to execute a downed enemy rather than another who might be standing right next to him. The good news is that I can honestly say that a lot of these abilities were very useful in combat. Some of them set up nice synergies, and it always felt like I was making interesting choices when it was time to level up. Beyond skills, the other significant way to customize the capability of each gear is through armor and weapons. Each piece of armor and every weapon can be modified. No, scratch that. Every piece of every weapon can be modded. Barrels, stocks, magazines, and more can all be enhanced in some way. And these custom items are not just one size fits all. The weapon parts in particular are specific to each class in a lot of cases. And these mods can offer an almost dizzying array of choices. Do you want to increase someone's evade stat or boost their health? And some items can offer a trade-off, like an accuracy bonus in exchange for a damage penalty. Thankfully, the system also allows the swapping of mods between characters even after they've been equipped. So if you want to modify the weapon of someone you're about to send into combat, you'll see everything you own in inventory. But if it's already equipped to another gear, it will be flagged as being in use. If you're willing to invest a few minutes prior to going out on each mission, it's very plausible to have the absolute best possible loadout on each soldier every time. By the way, one thing I did not see in the game at all is any kind of base building or strategic layer. The base is where the squad is maintained, and then they're sent out to the tactical mission map. There's no research to unlock weapons, no currency to earn and allocate according to your priorities, nothing like that. I say this not as a criticism, but simply as a statement of fact. And whether it's a plus or minus will really just depend on how much you enjoy doing that kind of management. For the most part, I want to keep the focus on what it's like to actually play Gears Tactics. But before we get to my final thoughts, let's talk for just 1 minute about the technical aspects of the game. In an era where so many games are shipped out as buggy messes, this one stands out as a rock-solid exception. It never once glitched, froze, or had so much as a frame rate stutter the entire time I played. While I wasn't trying to explicitly push it on that front, I ran the game on ultra settings at 1440p and never had a single hiccup. Now, sure, for all I know, once this is out in the wild and installed on millions of PCs, there could be a massive wave of bug reports, but my experience with all the technical aspects of this game were literally flawless. And regarding graphics and sound, I also have very little to say, except that I found them to be top-notch. The close-up screens of the characters were particularly impressive, but the battlefield maps were also really well done. The sound design, music, and voice acting all worked together very well to create the experience the developers were going for. Honestly, I cannot commend the developers enough for doing such an outstanding job on really all things technical with this game. Before I compare it to XCOM, I'd like to summarize my overall experience with Gears Tactics on its own terms. There's no question that it's an intense and challenging tactics game. During my first playthrough, there was a short period after the early missions where I started feeling like I was learning the ropes and could manage combat reasonably well. But right after I had that moment of hubris, the pressure started ratcheting up in a variety of ways, and that process never really stopped. Anytime I started to get used to the enemies we were fighting, a new one would be introduced with an ability that made me wonder how would we even cope with it. We did, mind you, but it would definitely take adjustments on my part. Then the next mission would be structured in a way that cranked up the tension all over again. The familiar mission types and enemies will still show up, but there's always something new to keep you on your toes and make you wonder once again if it can possibly be beaten until you win through yet again. The developers have made it pretty clear in their blog that they wanted to keep players off balance and take them out of their comfort zone. especially in the boss fights. I'd say they did an excellent job of realizing their goals and providing the game experience they were aiming for, at least for all of the difficulty levels above beginner. If you play the game at that level, I'd recommend that you go back and replay it on intermediate if you can reach the point where you feel like you've learned the ropes well enough, at least if you want the full shock treatment. Okay, time to talk about XCOM. For all their similarities, there are also a number of differences, both on the surface and down deep in the two games' DNA. At its core, XCOM is a game about positioning yourself on the map to gain advantage in combat. The soldiers have access to some very powerful abilities, but those are clearly secondary to the importance of flanking, avoiding getting flanked, etc. Gears Tactics packs so many enemies into a small space who relentlessly come at your squad from all angles. You will get flanked. You will take countless shots at enemies that are not flanked. I'm sure there will be people who argue this, but positioning, while very important, ends up taking something of a secondary role to managing the abilities of your squad. Just one simple example is the way enemies can go down to the ground when they're badly wounded. And if a gear executes him, the rest of the squad all pick up a free action point. If another gear executes another enemy that turn, then the rest of the squad will again pick up free action points. All those free action points will help you down more enemies, and if they're executed, that will yield still more actions. Even after playing a decent number of hours, I feel like I've only started to wrap my mind around the true potential of that one ability. And it's not even part of the skill tree. Every gear in the game has it. And if you start figuring out how to leverage each squad member's unique abilities, you'll really tear it up once you get some levels under your belt. Another big difference between the two is that Gears has missions that are very scripted. Each time you play Act 1, for example, you'll go to the same places and do the same things. The enemy reinforcements may drop in different locations, but you have a very strong sense of replaying the same missions your second time through. XCOM has only a handful of missions like that, partly because the story setup is so tissue thin most of the time. You simply go to one of a handful of map types and then find groups of enemies in fairly random locations. Yeah, the missions can feel repetitive in their own way, but nothing like the extent to which you'd experience it in Gears Tactics. Of course, Gears is a more scripted experience all the way around. The structure of acts and chapters is very buttoned down, and it comes with a specific number of missions, with story beats of varying lengths as you go along. Again, XCOM's story is pretty thin in comparison, even though there are certainly cutscenes and little moments sprinkled throughout. And while we're on the topic of acts, let's not forget the bosses that provide the climax to each of them. I know that some people have said the alien rulers were XCOM's answer to boss fights, and then the Chosen kind of took that mantle. But there is nothing in any XCOM game that I've ever played that feels anything like this. The crazy amount of health they have, their giant size. It's a level of intensity and craziness that's off the charts. I don't feel like I can do it justice. You almost have to play it for yourself. I always thought of XCOM as a tense game. It's not unusual to be outnumbered and outgunned, but what I eventually learned was that if I just started with the premise of what I absolutely had to get done for that turn, and then started breaking down which of my soldiers could do what to help make that happen, then I could make things work out, even if it was only by the skin of my teeth. I won't repeat the details of what I've said already multiple times, but Gears Tactics really dials the tension up to 11 and doesn't back off, and that's just something you have to be okay with if you're going to play it. I actually ended up turning the music volume off completely because all of these different things that it was bombarding with were starting to wear me down a little too much, and I just wanted to focus more on my moves. But Gears kind of feels like the bomb missions from Enemy Unknown and the final room in XCOM 2 mixed together and then distilled into concentrated form along with some vibes from Doom 2016. It is a heady cocktail that is not for the faint of heart. And before I move on from this, one thing that really is key to building that tension is the way that so many enemy reinforcements drop in on consecutive turns. In XCOM, a lot of the tension is generated from your fear that if you move a soldier to the wrong spot, then you'll trigger a new group of aliens. And that at least has the potential to be catastrophic. But in general, you can put together a plan for both the current turn and the next one, even if you know that something could happen to mess it up. In Gears Tactics, I feel like a lot of the planning is probably going to relate more to the timing of some of the abilities that I was talking about earlier. Of course, you'll think about the enemies who are already in front of you, but on most turns, you pretty much know that more enemies are coming. You just don't know how many or from which direction. So I don't want to say that you can't plan, but you have to do it in much broader terms, and just know going in that you're not going to quickly run the table so you can move on to the next encounter. The Gears battlefield, it's designed to be much more chaotic and meant to keep you on your toes in a way that XCOM just isn't. One concern I do have about Gears Tactics though is that because it's so scripted and story heavy, it could limit its replay value. That'd be a shame because I do think this is a game that benefits from multiple plays, especially if you want to play at higher difficulty levels. Look, I'm a veteran of many campaigns in XCOM, and I can flatly say that in no way did that translate into my being a good Gears Tactics player. You really need to apply yourself to mastering the timing of when to use which skills, and even the timing of enemy kills. And for most people, I'd expect that to take real time. There are a million little things that I could compare, but I mentioned most of them earlier. I certainly think that Gears is a prettier game when you're looking at character portraits, but I do find the battlefield map easier to follow in XCOM. XCOM is buggy, Gears isn't, at least not in my experience. XCOM does have a strategy layer and base building where Gears focuses much more on offering a variety of gear loadouts and more complex skill trees. So the bottom line again for me is XCOM and Gears Tactics share a lot of characteristics, but they also diverge quite a bit. I've done my best to give you an idea of what it's like to play Gears and how I see it comparing to the current King of the Hill in the genre. Am I going to declare one to be the best? No. No, I am not. In my eyes, the only real value in comparing the two in this video is to help you figure out whether you might enjoy Gears Tactics based on your own preferences. And if what I've said has helped you figure that out at all, then I'd appreciate it if you could give this video a like, because that will help convince YouTube's computers that other people might want to watch it too. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, you might want to do that, as I tend to mostly cover games that are in this genre, like XCOM. That's all for now though. Thanks for watching. I hope we see you next time.